Okay, we're all back. Yay! Oh, Georgia, you're muted. I love it when technology works.
Now, here we are. Yes. Hey.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's Learning Space. I am your co-host, Nicole Gallucci, with the CosmoQuest project, and my co-host through the wall, Georgia Bracey, is with us.
Hi, everybody.
Hi. If you've been following our Twitter feeds and things, I've just returned from Balticon, so a little bit tired, but don't seem to have the con crud yet, which is lovely. We are going to be discussing a topic brought up in a previous show by a commenter, and it wasn't necessarily something we could expand upon in that show, and so I decided we'd have a whole show about it. So they asked what teachers should do to deal with classroom situations around questions of, say, creationism, things that are controversial, and I'm using scare quotes, controversial scientific topics, or at least topics about science that will come up in the classroom, in the science classroom, that may be controversial to some people. And so I've invited Josh Rosenau to join us. Hello.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yay, I'm excited. I was on a panel with you at DragonCon last year?
Yeah, a couple years back.
Couple years back, yeah, and I was like token astronomer person, and I was just in awe of you and Eugenie Scott, so it was fun. So I brought you on to help us talk about that. A few particulars, first of all. If you would like to join the discussion, you can do so using the Q&A app. We will be watching that for comments. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you're watching this embedded somewhere, which I forgot to do on the CosmoQuest page, if you are watching this on Google+, you can click on the little thing on the screen that says Join the Conversation. Go to the Q&A app. And I see we've got a bunch of hellos from people, from Guido, from Atsuran, hello. Michael Jobin, hello. Guido says everyone seems to have survived Balticon. I'll let you know. We've survived in one way or another. Nancy Graziano, who was at Balticon, super helping us out at the table. So thank you, Nancy.
Excellent. Hey, everybody.
Yes. And Falconio. I keep moving around. Falconio Kronos is joining us as well. So thanks, guys. Please feel free to join us in the comments and ask questions along the way. So let's get started. Josh, why don't you tell us who you are, a little bit of your background, and maybe, I know this is asking a lot all at once, but we'll go through your work at the National Center for Science Education.
Sure. So I can talk a little bit about both of those at once, because I was a graduate student in ecology and evolutionary biology in Kansas starting in 2000, and you may remember that some crazy stuff was going on in the state school board in the mid-2000s, and so there I was, evolutionary biologist, evolution's under attack, and I got involved in that effort there, and turned out that I was having a lot more fun with it than I was with my research. Nicole knows nothing about that.
I don't know anything about that feeling.
Right? And so, a position opened up at NCSE to do what I had been doing for fun and actually get paid for it. So I was like, yay.
Nice.
Excellent.
And so what we do is a lot of, it's working with teachers, it's working with parents, communities, when there's a problem in schools, helping them make sure that evolution is taught, that climate change is taught, that these topics that are politically controversial, that certainly in society we spend a lot of time debating, but that are not scientifically controversial, that they're taught accurately, that science is taught as science.
Yeah. Tell more about the fun part, because to me what you do, it seems like there's a lot of conflict, right? There's a lot of debate, and what do you, obviously, you sort of get a lot out of that, and what do you really find that draws you to that and made you make that move?
I mean, part of it is just, there's the adrenaline of being in a little bit of a scuffle, but it's also the parents or the teachers who call us and say, a teacher who calls and says, I'm teaching evolution and I'm getting parents coming in and complaining, what do I do? By the time the teacher gets to us, they've probably been spending a lot of time obsessing over this and trying to think of what can they do, how do they get themselves out of this mess, because they know what the science is, they know what they're supposed to be teaching. Every professional society of teachers and scientists that they look at is telling them teach evolution, teach it thoroughly, put it at the beginning of the class, run it through, it's the foundation of modern biology. But they live in a community where that's not how people see it. So by the time they get to us, they're often really feeling down and really feeling like they don't know what they're supposed to do, but they do. You know, they're doing the right thing, and so it's really gratifying to be able to just step in and give them a pat on the back, and that's 90% of it, is just saying your instinct is right.
Yeah,
you're doing the right thing. Here's how we can help. Here's what's going on. You know, here are some resources that would help you out. Do you need to write a letter? Do you want me to look over your shoulder at it? Here are some people. Here, NCSD, I will say, is a membership organization. Membership is $35. It's cheap. And by becoming a member, you're in our database. And if something happens in your community, we'll call you and say, hey, there's this teacher who's in trouble. There's going to be a meeting. Would you be willing to go with the teacher? Would you be willing to sit with the principal and say how glad you are that they're teaching evolution? You know, or if there's something in the state legislature or a state board of education is considering science standards, we might ask you to write a letter. But there's only, you know, we're here in California in the Bay Area. If we write a letter, they're going to be like, why are those hippies writing to us and trying to tell us how to run our schools, right?
Yeah.
It's no good. It's much better if it's coming from someone in the community who we can talk to, who maybe they know them. They stood in line at the supermarket together. Their kids went through the schools. They're a voter. This matters to policymakers, right? It means much more for it to come from someone local than for it to come from us. So a lot of what we're doing is helping people on the ground who basically know what they have to do, but just need a little bit of help, a little bit of encouragement, and yeah, that's incredibly gratifying.
Yeah.
What are some I don't know if you can generalize on some situations that teachers have brought to you, and where their issues are coming from. Is it coming from in the classroom at the moment? Is it coming from parents after school?
Oh, and yeah, it varies. A lot of times the kids in class are not the ones who are doing things. It's usually going to be partly just because kids don't know, and this is why it's so dangerous if a teacher is teaching denial. You know, the teacher's saying, "Oh, climate change isn't real. Oh, evolution, that's a hoax." Kids don't know. They're in middle school or high school. They're incredibly impressionable. They don't have a basis for being able to say this is what science is, and what you're saying isn't science. They don't have a basis for saying, actually, I know what evolution is, and it's not a problem. And so, you know, if a teacher is teaching evolution and the parents have a problem with it, the kid comes home and says, oh, do you know what we learned in school today? The teacher said blah, blah, blah. And then the parents call the school, and they complain to the principal. They might complain to the teacher. And sometimes the administration is supportive. That's great. You know, if the administration says, look, there's nothing, they're teaching what the standards say, they're teaching what the textbook says, they're teaching what every expert would tell them to teach. I appreciate your concerns, but how can we deal with this outside of class? But sometimes administrators don't have a science background, they don't know what evolution is, they don't know what climate change is, they don't know exactly what science is and how to distinguish the scientific issues from the issues that are not scientific. And that's a huge part of it, and something we often tell teachers as a way to solve these problems. Sometimes it's worth just bringing the science teacher and the social studies class, bring those together for one day, and okay, we're going to talk about evolution. There are a bunch of issues there. It's controversial in society. There's a complicated history. There are interesting philosophical issues that come up. Let's talk about this. If you have questions, and the teachers can then divvy up the questions. If it's a science question, the science teacher talks about it. If it's a history, philosophy, religion question, the social studies teacher talks about it. and you model that distinction for the students. So if they don't yet understand the nature of science, the teachers can help model that, of how you draw those lines between science and non-science.
And that demonstrates the reality of reality being interdisciplinary
Right.
as well. So which is something that's hard to do in a school system where everything is split up by subject.
Right.
So what about what do you do when you run into, I mean, do you have parents contacting you if their students are being not taught evolution, or if they're being taught something alternative to it in class? What happens then?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our outreach is through science teacher meetings and things like that. So I think a greater fraction of teachers know about us than a fraction of parents, which is unfortunate. So a lot of the calls that we get are from parents, that their kid came home, and it's often there's some other inciting incident. So there was a case in Arkansas a few years back that we heard about through the ACLU, where it was a middle school world history class that the teacher was starting 6,000 years ago with Adam and Eve. And so that's a problem, right? I mean, not good. But what got the parent so upset was that they were getting ready for the middle school graduation ceremony, and she said, "Hey, this year, instead of having the Baptist minister from town give the invocation the way that they do every year, could you have my Methodist minister from outside of town do it just this once?" And the head of the PTA or whatever, rather than saying, "Oh, thank you for your suggestion, I'll consider it," hit reply all and said, "Look at this moron. How could she think we would possibly do that," right? So, I mean, not that a minister should be giving the convocation anyway, but
Right.
perhaps not be like overtly hostile to anyone else's religion along the way. And so that's what got the parent pissed off. And as a consequence, it came out that, oh yeah, the world history class started 6,000 years ago with Adam and Eve. So, and there was a case in Ohio where it came out that a kid it was also a middle school class, the teacher had, with a high voltage device, had burned a cross in one of the students' arms.
Oh, I remember hearing about that one. Oh.
Yeah, I mean,
that was awful.
And that's a case where that became public in the spring. The incident had happened, I think, in December. And the father was an insurance salesman in town and had made some complaints to the school district, but it wasn't until he finally filed a lawsuit, which meant that basically his insurance business had to shut down. No one would do business with him anymore because he filed this lawsuit. In the course of things, it turned out that the teacher had been teaching creationism. He had a stack of Bibles in the classroom, all sorts of other stuff that was really problematic. But the fear of that retaliation, of what happened, of the ostracism by the community, made him not want to come forward for as long as they did. So the natural response, if someone burns a cross in your kid's arm, right, is to grab a baseball bat and head down there and have some conversations. But it's hard. And so when people, that's why I say when people come to us, they've been doing a lot of research on it, they've been thinking about it a lot, and they really just need someone to hold their hand and say that they're doing the right thing, and talk to them about a way to resolve these issues that doesn't blow up like that.
What would you suggest? I mean, many parents may not have a scientific background, but they want to ensure that their kids are getting a good scientific background. How would you suggest they deal with a teacher who's not being entirely scientific in the classroom? Like, how do you help your kid, your student, learn and deal with that?
I think part of it is certainly meeting with the teacher, talking to them, just putting the concerns on the table. And even if, sometimes people don't know what's happening, I think every parent on back to school night at the beginning of the year or at parent-teacher conferences should ask should say to the science teacher, "I think evolution is really important. I think climate change is really important. I hope you're teaching it." Because I don't think teachers are hearing that. I think that they know that it's a politicized issue on the other side, that there's a lot of intensity from people who don't want these things taught. I think if every parent who wanted these things taught just said, I support you in teaching these things.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would make a huge difference. And if they know that something bad is happening, I think the first step should be a very polite, very honest, very open conversation with the teacher, because a lot of times the teacher, it's not malice. It's not a deep, dark conspiracy. The teacher just got some bad information someplace, maybe thinks that this is what they have to do to avoid having people harass them.
Yeah.
So giving them a little nudge the other way may be enough. And things can escalate from there, and every situation is a little bit different. Sometimes a good solution is to offer, I know this scientist who studies this. Maybe would you be willing to have him or her come in and give a guest lecture? Or come in and talk with you after class and just discuss the issue, talk about the lesson plan, and talk about the current state of the science. This is, especially with climate change, where the science really is progressing pretty rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
If you compare the IPCC report that came out this last year, the physical basis of what we know about climate change, compare what we know now to what the IPCC report in 1997 would say.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in high school, right? So if that's the last time I learned about, if that's what was the basis of what I learned about climate change in high school or in college that I'm teaching now, that would be science denial that I was teaching, right? I would be saying, well, we think it's probably getting warmer. Maybe people were involved. We're not totally sure. Consequences, yeah, it could be okay. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's wrong, right? That's just wrong. But 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when a lot of teachers were learning about this, that's sort of where the science was.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't have to be malice. It could just be that they never had a class that covered climate change. They've picked up what they can here and there. They got some bad information.
Mm-hmm.
And not all teachers, even if they have a biology degree, have taken an evolution class. They may not have studied it. So again, they're picking things up from here and there, and just having someone sit down and say, where are you getting this from?
Mm-hmm.
And have you looked at these great resources that are out there? Understanding Evolution from the University of California, Berkeley. It's a great website with lesson plans and resources and all sorts of great information that can help a teacher. It's with an up-to-date lesson plan. What's the current science? What do we know? What's the best way to teach about these things? Journals like Evolution, Education, and Outreach that are dedicated to talking about how to teach about evolution. There are a lot of great resources, and similarly on climate change, there's something called CLEANET, which is CLEANET.org, which is a curated collection of online teaching resources for climate change and energy and some related issues. So there are great resources out there. Teachers may not have come across them. Obviously, NCSE's website, ncsc.com, all sorts of wonderful stuff there. But yeah, just connecting them, just pointing them to those things may be enough. And if that doesn't work, sometimes you might have to go to the superintendent or the science chair in the school and try to work through the bureaucracy. And that's someplace where it can be useful to give us a call at NCSE, and just because we know how bureaucracies tend to work and can get a feel for what's likely to succeed in this particular instance. Because every district is a little bit different, the rules are different, the structure is different, the personalities are different. So figuring out the right way to go through, so that you don't, no one, if someone tells you no, that can sort of shut things down. But if you can get enough people to say maybe, until you get to the person who will say yes, that's ideal.
I'm sharing out those links on the event pages.
Great.
There's evolution.berkeley.edu, which is the evolution one you mentioned, and then CLEANET. I guess it's you spelled it better.
With just one N, it's confusing.
Yeah, it's CLEANET.org. But I'm sharing those out so you guys can bookmark that and share that around. Georgia, I'm wondering, did you actually run into any such issues when you were teaching? It may not have been climate change when you were teaching, but for evolution.
Yeah, no, I really was kind of out of the classroom by the time it really got to the public
Okay.
venue, I guess. So I guess in a way, it was lucky on my part. But I would just say in general, the kinds of strategies that Josh is talking about, basically just keeping a conversation going and keeping a conversation open and not being so either hostile or controversial in a sense that things shut down. Then you always have that possibility of somebody, coming around and learning and seeing, what the science is and what is the correct thing to, be teaching in the classroom. And so I've just been thinking here that, that kind of strategy is what I used, for all kinds of issues that come up in the classroom as you're teaching with parents, and because you've got a variety of students and parents out there, and it seems like there's always just going to be something, but that strategy it works for all kinds of issues, and for parents out there, to go to the teacher first, is always good, and try to have that conversation start there. And then having the support of others and resources out there, really does. It just that you're not alone is such a big help. So having a site and a group like this is really key. It can make all the difference.
Cool. We have a question from Guido. Guido's in Germany. He said, it's a sad thing this is even an issue today. Teaching evolution in Europe doesn't seem to be a big problem. At least I've never heard of any teachers here in Germany encountering resistance like they do in the US. Josh, maybe you can talk a little bit about what the situation is like nationally in the US and whether you've heard of the differences or similarities abroad.
So, I mean, one of the things that makes things a lot harder in the US is compared to most other countries. I don't know the particulars of the German education system, but most countries.
It's similar to ours, unlike the rest of the EU. But
that's right, yeah. But for the most part, we have 17,000 school districts, and they're all fairly autonomous. There are state boards of education that set standards, and the school districts take those and turn that into curriculum. School districts select textbooks. They generally keep an eye on what the standards are doing, because that's what the tests are based on, and if the state does textbook adoption, then the textbook adoption is based on what the standards say. But there are 50 different standards. Fewer now, because there's something called Next Generation Science Standards, which is an attempt to have the same science standards for every state, which is surprisingly radical.
Yes.
And because evolution and climate change were both are central themes in how those standards were written, there are some states that have tried to block adoption. Wyoming, the legislature forbade the adoption of next generation science standards because they include climate change.
Mm-hmm. A lot of it.
So.
Yeah.
So in a lot of the world, it's a national curriculum, more or less. I know in Turkey, for instance, where there's a fairly active creationist movement, when the Islamist parties are in power, are part of the governing coalition, if the education ministry is given to the Islamist parties, they print textbook. The Ministry of Education prints new textbooks every year. So when the Islamist parties are in power, they take evolution out. And then if the secularist parties are in power, they put it back in for the next year's edition. So in a case like that, it can be problematic. But in general, if we had national science standards and a national science curriculum, the nature of this problem would be really different. What tends to happen in Kansas when I was there, in a lot of other states when there are efforts to water down what's in the state standards, there's a political backlash, and the people who are trying to put creationism or climate change denial into state standards get voted out of office. Right. And good science gets restored. When people don't pay attention to school board elections, to state board of education, it's obscure. But when they do start paying attention, when there's something controversial like that, then it tends not to stick.
We have a question or suggestion/question from Michael Jobin. Would a teacher say to students that we are teaching science, not theology? Are there theology courses in college or grade school or at these different levels we're talking about? it depends on public or private, but maybe how can the teacher bring in the theology? Like, where does theology fit in the education system?
Yeah, I don't think that there are probably any other than a religious school that there are going to be theology classes.
Mm-hmm.
Some schools might have a comparative religion class, and in my ideal world, every student would take a comparative religion class because I think it's really important to understand where all of these conversations are coming from and how different people are coming at these big questions. And I think part of the reason that we have these fights is that evolution does raise big, interesting, complicated philosophical questions about what does it mean to be human? What happens to us after we die? Do we have souls? Right? These are not trivial questions. And how students respond to the science is shaped by their understanding, by how they interpret it in light of those other questions.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a huge range of religious responses to evolution. As to climate change and to lots of other scientific questions, to the Big Bang. There's some people who do think that it's just their theology says that they can't accept evolution, and there are other people who integrate it thoroughly into their theology.
Yeah.
Francis Collins is the director of the National Institutes of Health, right? He's an evangelical Christian who thinks evolution is good stuff, and is the way that we're going to understanding it is how we solve cancer and how we find the next antibiotic and how we solve these critical medical issues. So yeah, there's a huge range, and understanding that I think is an important part of addressing the conflicts that we see.
Yeah, I went to a Catholic school from kindergarten through the end of high school. And I got a really strong science background. Like, evolution was not an issue. We taught it, we talked about it. I did argue with a nun in my religion class about evolution once, but that was in a religion class.
Right.
It was never an issue for my biology classes.
When I was in Kansas, when bad things were happening, there were people who weren't even Catholic who were talking about sending their kids to Catholic schools because they knew they would learn evolution there.
Yeah, for us, where we were location-wise, my parents knew I'd get a better education there. Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
Let's see, what else? The comments keep moving around in the Q&A app. So
One from Nancy.
Thank you. I get confused.
Is that okay? So this is from Nancy Graciano. What are your feelings about those states where legislation is either proposed or already passed, which mandates teaching creationism disguised as intelligent design? So that's something you hear a lot about too, and maybe you could talk about how that kind of plays a role, intelligent design.
Yeah. So in intelligent design is this form of creationism that's sort of vague about the particulars. If you go to like Ken Ham's Creationism Museum, where he's got the ark and the whole thing, he's really specific about when everything was created and how and who did it, and 6 days, 6,000 years ago, there was a global flood, Noah saved all the animals, the whole thing. Intelligent design is more like, well, at some point, somehow, some sort of intelligence, we don't know exactly who. God.
I'm not saying it was aliens.
Right. It could be aliens, it could be fallen angels, it could be time travelers, genetically engineering the past. It could be anything. We don't know. So yeah, it's meant to get around this long history of court rulings that say you can't teach creationism. Mm-hmm. And in 2005, there was a court case where a federal judge looked at it and said, yeah, this is the same old creationism, the same rulings apply. And since then, since 2005, and actually starting a little bit before that, we've seen a different strategy. So I was going to say that we haven't really seen laws that would have required creationism, but in the last couple of years, there have actually been a few weird bills filed. But the big thing that we're seeing are what people refer to as academic freedom acts, mm-hmm. which sounds really great, right? It sounds, how could you be against academic freedom? Who doesn't love freedom? Mm-hmm. But what these are doing is trying to redefine academic freedom so that it would say, if you're a parent, if you're a student, or you're a teacher, you can't be punished for encouraging students to think critically about all these controversial topics like evolution and climate change. And often evolution, climate change, chemical origins of life, and human cloning are the 4 topics that are specifically mentioned. Mm-hmm. human cloning not really being something that usually comes up in a high school science class.
Didn't mind, but that's because Gattaca came out that year.
There you go. I think that that's a cryptic reference to weird abortion, stem cell research sorts of issues that the religious right gets worked up about, as they do about evolution, and other people on the political right get worked up about climate change. So that's what unifies those four topics, right? It's not their scientific status, right? It's not that they're scientifically controversial, it's that they're politically controversial, and that people want to make hay out of that. So laws like this passed in Louisiana and in Tennessee a couple years ago, and there have been, I'm not sure what the current count is, but 50 some odd, almost 60 that have been filed in the last decade in, I think, 13 or 14 states, or maybe up to 15 even. So it's something that the Discovery Institute, which is the institutional home of intelligent design creationism, has been, they developed this as model legislation that they've been shopping around, and other people in the political right and the religious right have taken it up as their issue as well. So, and that's something that we've worked with local activists a lot to try to get them to fight back against those. And it's something where it's hard because it's academic freedom. How can you be against that? How can you be against critical analysis? But the practical consequence is that it makes it that much harder for an administrator to say, you have to teach evolution. Right. It's in the standards, it's in the curriculum, it's in the textbook, you have to teach it. And the teacher can say, I don't want to teach it, or I'm going to teach both sides. You know? And it's just a little bit harder. It's one more barrier for an administrator or a parent who wants to say this is not okay.
Well, it was creationism first, they couldn't get that passed. It was intelligent design, they couldn't get that passed. So it feels like this was the next step in ways that they could.
And the arguments of intelligent design are, the arguments of creationists are fundamentally, if you look at when they were requiring equal time laws in the 1980s, when equal time for creationism and evolution, a lot of the creationist arguments even there are negative arguments. They're attacks on evolution.
Right.
So the claim now is, oh, we just want to teach critical thinking by examining both sides of evolution. But the arguments that they want to present against evolution are the same old creationist objections. They just take out the "and therefore God did it."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're getting some really great comments. I don't think I'm going to be able to get through all of them. Some of them is just discussion, and we appreciate all the discussion going on. Mentions of the flying spaghetti monster, of course, as if you're going to give equal time to, that's kind of how that joke started, is if you're going to give equal time to creationism, you have to give equal time to my god, the flying spaghetti monster, which has become a very popular meme. Guido points out that religion is a separate class in Germany, taught as a theological history class. Academic freedom, from Sylvan Westby, is granted for research, but not for teaching. Yeah, so some. Oh, here's a good question from Sylvan Westby. I guess this is for if a teacher is in a place where he or she is uncomfortable, and you have, and I'm going to specify that not just religious community, but specific people who are, denialists of evolution. Do you continue to teach it in the class in a more subdued way, or do you just go ahead and teach it and risk the parents taking their kids out of the school? I don't know if this is.
That's tricky, and it's something that a lot of teachers experience. In no state does a majority of the public support teaching only evolution. This is really? some survey research that some researchers at Penn State did a couple years back, where they aggregated poll data, a lot of different surveys that people had done over the years, asking questions like that. And even in Massachusetts, which was the most evolution-friendly state, it was only about 40% who endorsed only teaching evolution. The idea of teaching both sides, teaching, it sounds so appealing. Right. There was a couple years back, the Miss USA pageant had the contestants come in and sat them down and asked them some spontaneous questions, just not in front of an audience, just in front of a black backdrop, and videoed the responses. And one of the questions they asked that year was, should evolution be taught in school? And something like 37 of them, I transcribed them for my sins. I sat there and I transcribed this video. And something like 37 of them, in the course of that, said something, made some reference. The question was, should evolution be taught in school? Not should both sides be taught, should creationism be taught, should evolution be taught? Spontaneously, 80% of them almost said something about, we should teach both sides.
Wow.
Well, we're teaching creationism, so we should teach evolution also. You know, it was just, it's deeply ingrained in our mindset, it's deeply ingrained in the conversation, and it appeals to the idea of fairness and all of these values that are really, they're good values. We should value fairness. We should give equal time to all points of view. The problem is that it's not about points of view, it's about evidence. It's about what is science and what's not. And that's really hard, because in the broader public discourse around these things, it's not just about science, it's about a whole bunch of other stuff. And so I think a teacher in a religious community like that, it's a really tough challenge. And certainly one of the things that people do, the question talked about, should you talk about gradual change over time rather than using the word evolution? And sometimes that can be a really effective strategy, at least to start off. If you think that students have been sort of primed to think bad things when they hear the word evolution, to think bad things when they hear the word Darwin, yeah, just sort of introduce the idea. One thing I often will do when someone wants to pick a fight over people sometimes just call us in the office because they want to pick a fight.
Yeah, of course.
So everybody, creationists, everybody across the spectrum, if you agree that you can do DNA fingerprinting and track back the human family tree, right? No one disputes this point. The creationists think you can track it back to Adam and Eve. The rest of us don't. But yeah, DNA, you can make a family tree of humans. So I say, all right, well, let's take a chimpanzee, throw that into the mix. You still produce a tree. You can still, you have that same tree. Throw a gorilla into that same mix. You still can produce a tree. Throw gibbons. So, and the basic mechanism is not in dispute, right? They agree that you can get an accurate family tree by taking a DNA sample and doing this thing. So talk about it. I mean, I wouldn't use humans as the first example in this scenario, but you could take, well, we know we can do that for humans. Now let's do that for dogs. We can do that for dogs and figure out the dog breeds. Now throw in wolves. Now throw in foxes. Now throw in bears. Now throw in cats. And the basic ideas of evolution, the idea of adaptation, the idea of natural selection, the idea of a tree of life, you can develop a lot of this without using the word evolution, without talking necessarily about human evolution until you've gotten people to basically accept the idea and then say, okay, so we're talking about evolution here. The same thing works for humans. Is this so scary?
Yeah. It's because the implications that seem to be scary.
Yeah, and a lot of people, if you say we're going to talk about evolution, they think we're going to talk about how, it means that you're going to talk about how God doesn't exist and how souls don't exist and how people are just animals, and it's going to be a discussion of moral philosophy and all this other stuff. And so if you just say, look, we're talking about gene frequencies and we're talking about selection and a lot of this is pretty obvious stuff once you get it. It was hard to figure it out the first time, but now that we know it, it's actually pretty straightforward. Right. And once you get into it, it's not that scary. And then you say, that's what evolution is. That's what we've been talking about. What did you think it was going to be? Let's talk about that. Let's air that out. Let's put it on the table. Sure. And maybe that's a good place to bring in the social studies teacher and say, there are some other issues that come up around this. Let's talk about that with the social studies teacher here and distinguish the scientific issues from the other ones, and we can talk about all of them, but let's draw those distinctions.
Yeah, that's a great conversation to have with the class, and I bet you could do that unpacking just with the idea of science and what is science too, because that's very interrelated to all this, as you mentioned, and sometimes people don't have a great idea of what does it mean for something to be scientific? What kind of evidence is scientific evidence? It's not just, like people's opinions, like you say. So having that sort of conversation so that people are really sure of what we're talking about when we say science, and this is scientifically accurate, just like, and maybe not so scary, and with all the negative implications that sometimes people come to the table with about that word too. So just getting all that out there is a great
Yeah, and to start the nature of science conversation with something that's not as contentious either. You use an example of something that's not science, that everybody agrees is not science, that or a case where the phlogiston or the celestial ether, something that, or phrenology, that nobody takes seriously now, but that was taken seriously at some point.
Yep.
And talk about how it was decided that that wasn't science, and then use that as a basis to build on. And the same people who produced the Understanding Evolution website also have a site called Understanding Science that has a lot of great resources for talking about lesson plans for different age levels, all the way down to elementary school, to talk and up to general public, adult audiences, to talk about what science is and how science works, and how to move beyond the sort of boring, trivial, and really wrong linear scientific method idea that first you do some research, then you form a hypothesis, then you make some predictions from the hypothesis, then you construct an experiment.
The things we make the science fair kids do.
Right. I mean, it's a fine framework, but it's not how scientists actually do what they do, and it's worth talking about how scientists do what they do, and that it is this human process, and that peer review is an important part of it, and that scientists are humans and they do stuff for stupid human reasons, and that that's okay because science has ways to correct for that and to catch us when we're doing stuff for stupid human reasons rather than for smart human reasons. And that it's a collective enterprise, to talk about all those different parts of it, and how that leads us to be really confident that evolution happened and is happening, to be really confident that climate change is real. That these are not, it's easy to think of science as a collection of facts, as an encyclopedia, just a bunch of knowledge. And you can say, well, you've got a whole bunch of books that say evolution is true, I've got a book that says evolution isn't true. Take that, scientists. And so understanding where that comes from, how do we know where understanding the process, that it's not just a bunch of facts, but that those facts had to go through this process, that they were vetted by a lot of different people whose first incentive was to try to knock down the established knowledge.
Right.
That's a really valuable part of the process, and that's why scientific knowledge is so important and is such an important way of doing things. And it's something that it comes naturally. We all do it for all sorts of things. If the car doesn't start in the morning, you do an experiment, right? That's how you figure out what's broken so that you can get it started again.
Right. Yeah, I think that's good on both sides to separate the scientific facts from the potential implications, interdisciplinary philosophical implications. Because I personally have seen it on both sides as well. I see religious people and non-religious people doing that in their arguments, probably mostly in the heated online arguments that are never, well, not never, but usually not a good idea. And it's really good to pull out, here are the facts. Let's not go overboard. And with climate change, I feel like that must be a particularly tricky place to be, because it's not, whereas this creationism debate's been going on for the 20th century in pop culture or the popular sphere, but we're really new to climate change, as you said it before, in every sense. So how does that change your strategy in dealing with these issues with teachers and parents with regards to climate change?
In some ways it's easier, and in some ways it's harder. As we were saying before, the science is changing more rapidly. We're learning a lot more, and so it's harder for teachers to stay on top of, and it's easier for bad information to slip in. It's new, so it's not in the standards often. It's often not in the textbooks,
right.
And the teachers don't necessarily know whether they're supposed to be teaching it, or they all can sort of point their fingers at somebody else and say, oh, I'm the biology teacher, that's for earth science, and then nobody takes earth science classes. And there are really important physics and chemistry issues that come up around climate change, and it could make a really interesting practical way to talk about how, about some interesting physical processes and chemical processes. But those teachers probably aren't thinking that that's part of what they're supposed to be doing. So just getting it into the curriculum, just getting teachers thinking about how do they have those discussions. But the fact that it's new, part of the problem with evolution is that for 80 or 90 years now, people have been thinking that as part of their identity, if I'm going to be a good Christian, if I'm going to be the right sort of Christian, I can't accept evolution. Right? This basically starts after the Scopes trial, that the fundamentalist movement, which at that same time was moving from being an urban intellectual upper class movement to being a rural lower class anti-intellectual movement, it becomes anti-evolution. It takes up William Jennings Bryan's mantle, and as a matter of identity says we have to reject evolution. That's a really hard dynamic to break.
Yeah.
If you think that in order to be a good person, you have to reject this science, which is more important?
Yeah.
Right? Being a good person, going to heaven, eternal life with your loved ones, or getting the science right.
Yeah.
It's not a contest. I mean, I wish it were, but it's not. And so that's deeply ingrained. The idea that there are two sides, there's evolution and creationism, is really built deeply into American politics at this point, and it's a hard dynamic to break. Climate change, we're not there yet, although I worry that it's getting close. You see in the last election, a lot of the Republican candidates had at some point endorsed climate change policies, right? Newt Gingrich sat down on a couch with Nancy Pelosi and did an ad for Al Gore's nonprofit to talk about how everybody agrees we should do something about climate change, and went up on stage during the campaign and said that, oh, everyone makes mistakes. That was my biggest mistake ever, right?
Yeah. It seems like
some of us would probably think he made worse mistakes, but
Yeah.
But the idea that he thought he had to do that suggests that it's becoming a matter of personal of political identity, which is really scary if that takes hold.
It's not necessarily religious personal identity, but it's a political, economic personal identity.
Exactly.
Thing.
Yeah. So it's the same psychological process, just with a different set of motives.
Yay. Atsurin says the thing about teaching both sides, because this is a topic we talk about with media too, is that even if it actually were a controversial topic, the controversy should be tackled in academia by science, not given for kids to confuse them. If a topic is controversial, the place is not in schools. Do you tend to agree with that?
To a degree. There are, I think there's a lot of research that shows, and intuitively it makes sense that students respond well, they engage more deeply with topics when there's a chance for them, when it's not just presented to them on a platter. If there's a chance for them to explore the ideas, using argumentation and debate in the classroom can be a really effective pedagogical approach. The problem is using a science class to debate things that aren't science.
Right.
So having students do independent research and come up with their own sense of how much sea level rise we should expect by the end of this century as a result of climate change. That could be a really interesting debate. Every student then has to argue their position based on the literature, based on what they've read, and defend how they got to that. But to argue about whether climate change is happening, we're past that. That's not a live scientific controversy anymore. Which dinosaurs had feathers? That's a really interesting question. We know that some of them did. Some of them do right now. We know that, and there are tyrannosaurids that have fuzz on them. There were probably tyrannosauruses with feathers, right? That's crazy. There's some suggestions that you can find that there was fuzz on Triceratops, which is the other big branch of dinosaurs.
Yeah.
So maybe all of the dinosaurs had feathers, maybe just some of them did. Maybe it was an ecological adaptation, but they all had the genes to produce them. this is an area of ongoing research.
Right.
And so in a classroom, that would be a lot of fun to debate. But not, did dinosaurs evolve? Right? We're past that.
And also,
And
you're
so,
not asking the
yeah.
students to decide the answer to the question, because we don't know yet. And you're not asking, I feel like asking students to decide for themselves means they're going to pick a side and stick with it.
Yeah.
If the data doesn't exist for something such as which dinosaurs had feathers, you can't let the kid just say, I'm going to believe this now.
And the people who have done a lot of the research and have been advocating this argumentation method in classrooms make that point, that the goal is not that students should reinvent science,
right,
but that the teacher, where there is something that is well established, that the teacher's job is to use the argumentation to help students understand how we got to that point. How did scientists reach that consensus? And where there's something that is a legitimate live controversy within science, to understand how scientists are using the tools of science to resolve those questions. And there's a paper that Jeannie Scott and Glenn Branch wrote, it's probably 10 years ago now, about the teach the controversy rhetoric. How do you decide what is a real controversy? What are the criteria for a legitimate controversy to be talking about in a classroom? Not just in terms of, is it a real scientific controversy, but is it pedagogically appropriate? Do the students have the background that they would need to understand it? I mean, Origin of Life, there are some really interesting, pedagogically it could be really interesting, because there's a lot of different ways to come at the question, there's a lot of evidence for a lot of different hypotheses, and we don't have a good answer. But for a high school student to be able to debate that, they would have to understand a lot of chemistry, a lot of geology, a lot of biology, a lot of physics, crystallography. There's just a whole bunch of complicated science that they would have to have in order to have that conversation. So it's not a great topic for a high school classroom, but it could be interesting as an introductory college class to get people to dive into those interesting scientific questions and use the question of how did life get started as an entree into basic chemistry, basic geology, basic biology.
Sure, yeah. We have one more question I want to get to. I know, Georgia, you have a meeting if you have to run.
Oh,
That's cool.
I will.
Okay. This is, again, from Nancy Graziano. She says, I'm glad my daughter has already graduated college, and I don't have to deal with this. But what recourse do scientifically literate parents have when their kids are subjected to creationism, intelligent design? I think we can add climate denial in there, climate change denial as fact. What if, worst case scenario, the teacher's teaching that and the administration's not budging? What can you do for your kid's education?
Right, and Nancy's question says with no evolution to balance, but it doesn't matter if someone balances it, right? Intelligent design or other forms of creationism just don't belong in classrooms. And I mean, it's a First Amendment violation, and it's teaching kids stuff that's not right. It's not science. And teaching something as science that's not science in a science classroom is not just misinforming kids about evolution, which is a really important topic. It's teaching them something wrong about what science is and how science works. And that's going to follow them for a long time also. So, the first thing that I would always say, step 0, is contact us at NCSE, because every situation is a little bit different. We have friends who are lawyers. We have, if it comes to that, although the hope for the most part is that it doesn't. Lawsuits are really rough and they're not fun for anyone. Sometimes they're necessary. In Dover, Pennsylvania, where that lawsuit was filed, it wound up being cathartic for the community to be able to have a judge come in and say, "You're right, you're wrong, you pay them a bunch of money, that's it." But for the most part, it's really hard to be a plaintiff, and we don't try to put anyone into those shoes. We want to resolve things quietly and behind the scenes if it's humanly possible. So we can talk people through that. But certainly starting out by having a conversation with the teacher, especially if your kids are coming back and saying, this is what we were taught, sometimes kids aren't always paying close attention in class. And I mean,
What?
I hate, I know,
And you should hear what kids tell teachers about their parents.
yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Not always the whole story.
So it's certainly,
Check it out.
going to the teacher and not going in making accusations, but just saying, my kid said this, and maybe something got lost in translation here. Can you tell me more about this assignment?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Open-ended, not what the hell are you doing? Our philosophy is always that you can always escalate, you can always move up the chain of command, you can always be more aggressive, you can always threaten lawsuits. But if you go in threatening lawsuits, or if you go in saying, oh my God, what the hell's wrong with you? What are you doing to my child, you monster? That's going to shut down the conversation, and it's going to be a lot harder to have any sort of open exchange, any sort of satisfactory resolution, any sort of meeting of minds. If you go in aggressively to begin with, you can always get aggressive, but once you've gotten aggressive, it's really hard to walk it back.
Yeah, that's right.
And we run this this webinar series at NCSE, and there's one that we have, the video is archived on our website, where we talked about some of this, of what do you do if you have a conflict in your community, how do you resolve it? And Nicole, I can send you a link to that.
Sure.
I don't know if I have it right at my fingertips. Actually, I can pull it up pretty quick. Hold on.
Nancy also adds that I'm going to demand that Santa Claus be taught in science classes.
Right.
There's a really interesting physics way to teach physics about using Santa Claus. Matt Lowry does in his high school.
Fun.
Yeah, it doesn't end well for Santa.
The thermodynamics.
Yeah, the thermodynamics of Santa Claus, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the step zero in any sort of conflict like that is definitely to give us a call at NCSE, because every situation is different, and sometimes we've dealt with something similar in that same community before, and we know the landscape a little bit. We know, oh, this is the person to talk to. This happened before, and this was the administrator who helped out, and give them a call, and it'll all get patched up really quick. Or, yeah, this teacher does this all the time, and we don't have a good angle on it yet, or whatever it might be.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. I'm going to do a few quick announcements, and then we'll wrap up, and you can remind people again where to find all this information. So this
I need to sneak out, so I'm just going to say,
okay.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, and thanks, Josh. It was great. Great to talk.
Thanks for having me.
Okay.
Good meeting you.
See you next week.
So we are at Learning Space this week. Next Friday is the weekly Space Hangout, hosted by Fraser Kane. We'll be covering the news stories of the week starting at noon Pacific. Of course, we will talk about the gamma ray burst that didn't exist. Speaking of the nature of science, if you were on the internet last night, all the astronomers went bibbly crazy because it looked like a gamma ray burst may have gone off in our nearby galaxy of Andromeda. And after several hours of follow-up and analysis, it turned out it didn't happen. It was a bump in the data. So if any of you guys saw that, you should check it out. I'm sure we'll be discussing that on Friday. Sunday night is Sunday night's the virtual star party, weather permitting, for our astronomers scattered around. They seem to be centered in the west coast of the U.S. They will be giving you live views of the night sky through their telescopes, through their webcams, through all that good stuff. That starts, I think, Sunday at 9 p.m. Pacific now, so it's a bit late for the rest of the U.S. But that'll be that one coming up. Monday, I'm gonna go. I know Pamela's on travel again, so I'm not sure what the Astronomy Cast schedule shows at the moment, but they usually do Astronomy Cast if they can at noon on Mondays, and then we come back to Wednesday and we do Learning Space. And as I pull up the schedule, we will be same time, same place. We will be talking about. Oh, actually, that one may have changed time. and date. We were originally scheduled to talk about the Challenger Learning Center, but we had to reschedule that one. So stay tuned to the schedule. We'll have something up next week for that. Josh just shared the link with me for how to respond to attacks on science education from the NCSC website. So definitely check out the NCSC website for a lot of these resources. And Josh, do you want to have any parting words of advice or resources people could use?
The NCSC's website has a lot of great resources on it, and I definitely would encourage people to check that out at ncsc.com. I mentioned understanding evolution and understanding science.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the process of working with UCMP to create an Understanding Global Change website as well, which is going to be really exciting when it comes out, I think, next year or late this year. So, and if people are looking for good resources on debunking climate change denial or evolution, creationist claims, talkorigins.org is awesome. Mm-hmm. There's an index of creationist claims, so if someone comes at you with something weird, you can always go there. And skepticalscience.com does the same thing for climate change, and it's really great. And I'm going to have, in an hour, I'm going to be doing a webinar with John Cook from Skeptical Science and Shauna Thiel from Media Matters for America. We're going to be talking about how to debunk and respond to science denial. So there's still time to register.
Where can people register? Is it on the site?
Yeah, if you go to our website, you should be able to find a link somewhere.
Okay, cool. Yes, so thank you for joining us, even though you were already all kinds of scheduled today.
No, I'm in webinar mode, clearly.
Webinar mode, okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for the great discussion, the great questions. This is, of course, a really interesting and nuanced and important topic. So thank you again, Josh, for joining us and having this discussion with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for the great questions and discussion.
Thank you. We'll see you guys next week. Bye.